Hello, and welcome to Restoring the Future, Valuing Nature. I'm Sue Neales, journalist, agricultural scientist, and farmer, and I have the pleasure of moderating this important Greening Australia webinar today, exploring the economic benefits of climate action and the cost of inaction. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and any other Indigenous people who have joined us today. We have guests dialing in from all around Australia today, so I invite all of you to introduce yourselves in the chat box and acknowledge the country from where you are joining us. Please select the To Everyone option when posting so we can see all your messages. And thank you all for joining us. In this webinar, we will be discussing the economic benefits of climate action and the cost of inaction. To discuss this topic, we're delighted to have three special guests today joining with us. Our panellists, Elizabeth Rose, Partner, Climate Change and Sustainability Services with Ernst & Young, Ryan Swenson, Head of ESG and Corporate Affairs, Officeworks, and Damien Walsh, Managing Director, Bank Australia. We'll be running a Q&A session with our panellists towards the end of the event, so I invite you to use the chat box to post any questions throughout the discussion, which we will then put to our panellists in the final 15 minutes of this webinar. Before I introduce our panellists, I'd like to set the context for today's conversation. This year, Greening Australia is celebrating 40 years of restoring landscapes across the country. In 1982, the organisation was born out of the need for change. As the latest IPCC report, released this week, affirms that need for change has only become more urgent in 2022. Australia is at the forefront of climate crisis, and yet we are consistently ranked as one of the worst performers on climate action. The cost of this inaction on people, nature, and the economy is astronomical. In a report last year, Deloitte Access Economics estimated that natural disasters currently cost the Australian economy $38 billion per year. And that was before this year's catastrophic East Coast floods. Even under a low emissions scenario, by 2060, we can expect this cost in Australia to rise to at least $73 billion annually as bushfires, storms and floods become more frequent. In fact, according to the World Economic Forum, US $44 trillion of economic value, or over half the world's GDP, is moderately or highly dependent on nature, and therefore currently at risk as a consequence of climate change, biodiversity loss and economic degradation. Yet in Australia and around the world, there remains a perceived tension between environmental action and economic progress, that you can only have one at the expense of the other. So today, our panellists have come together to discuss the true value of our natural environment and the cost of not recognising this value, and to discuss some of the tensions that we have seen emerging over the past few years. This week, Greening Australia also released a white paper titled Valuing Nature, Climate Action and the Economy, which you may like to read after this conversation. We'll share a link in the chat box at the end of the event. But for now, we are privileged to have Elizabeth, Ryan and Damien joining us today to talk on the topic of valuing nature. So I'd like to introduce and welcome Elizabeth Rose, Damien Walsh and Ryan Swenson. Thank you for joining us, Elizabeth, Ryan and Damien. We only have 1 hour, so let's get straight into it. We have questions to each of you. There may be some discussion, and then, as we said, we'll have the Q&A from the public at the end. Elizabeth, you have years of experience providing advice to government and leading corporates in relation to sustainability strategy and reporting, climate change risk and strategy, greenhouse gas and natural capital accounting. Can you please explain how the economy and the environment intersect?
Absolutely, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to join you from Yagara country in southern Brisbane. There is absolutely a growing recognition that that our economies at every scale, from local, national, global, are deeply, deeply connected to our environment. We're connected to biodiversity, to our natural assets, and to the stocks or environmental flows that they provide that really support our economy as well. These are the services that we as humans receive through transformation of these natural resources into goods and services such as clean air, water, and food. And we really need to be understanding and valuing this natural capital, these ecosystem services, as part of our conventional economic system. This is one of the fundamental transformative processes that we need to go through. From an economic perspective, when we think about ecosystem services, they fall into a number of different categories. So the first of those is around provisioning services. So these are the benefits that we directly extract from the environment. So these are things like food, water, medicine, timber through forestry, fibre that we use for clothes and materials and so forth. Ecosystems also provide us with regulating services as well. So the regulation or mediation of the fundamental systems that we rely on for survival, such as our climate, is a really great one and really front of mind at the moment as well. There's also supporting services that nature provides to us that enable us to drive our economies. So these are things like photosynthesis, the creation of soils, the water cycle, and so forth. All of these fundamentally enable our economy to keep on going. However, there's increasing recognition that we're exploiting these natural resources far beyond their capacity to cope, and we're actually reaching critical tipping points in many areas. And it's really interesting. I've seen quite a shift over the past few years from environmental issues being regarded as something off to the side to increasingly being something that's distinctly environmental and economic in nature. And I think one of the great reports that I read every year is the World Economic Forum Risk Report. And this year we found that the top 3 most severe risks to the global economy over the next 10 years are very much economic risks. And these include climate action failure, extreme weather events, and biodiversity loss. Also included in those top 10 over the next 10 years are human environmental damage and natural resources crises. So we're starting to see financial frameworks and economic frameworks that are helping us to understand these risks as well. So we saw the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, that was released back in 2017, which provides a framework for businesses and governments to understand climate change as very much a financial and economic risk and issue. And then recently we've seen the development of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which similarly leverages that, that same kind of framework that we have for the TCFD, but building in their considerations around biodiversity and ecosystem into those approaches. I think one of the fundamental barriers, though, of considering nature as an economic risk is the fact that we're not yet able to measure it consistently and reliably. So from a climate change perspective, we have tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, which enables us to both measure emissions and measure abatement. And so we kind of have the infancy of a market happening there for dealing with climate change. We're not yet there for biodiversity, and this is a massive barrier that we have to address from an economic perspective.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll now go to Ryan from Officeworks. Ryan, what's your take on the economic considerations around action on climate change and biodiversity loss in Australia?
Thank you, Sue, and hello everyone. It's great to join you. I'm on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. So I suppose what we've also heard is probably 2 things. We know the cost of inaction on climate change is really significant. And we also know that the most effective way to decarbonise is putting a price on carbon, so that all of those externalities and impacts on biodiversity loss right through are really captured. However, we're not in that policy framework. And so I think, when we look at it from the private sector perspective, which globally contributes 75% of GDP, a really important role for the private sector to think creatively and quite holistically about how can we put value on taking action on climate change in a way that makes sense to our business and in a way that would support investment that really mobilizes and gets us to where we need to be at the pace we need to get there. So, in our world, if I look at a couple of examples, when we look at, say, our Restoring Australia initiative that we work with Greening Australia on, when we developed that a couple of years ago, or back in 2017, it really was looking at, all right, how do we put a business case around investing in planting 2 trees for every 1 used? And so, firstly, it was about understanding our customers, and what we understood is that they really wanted to make more sustainable choices. They wanted it to be easy, they wanted it to be affordable, and of good quality. And so we developed a program that was really around that. And in doing so, we knew that we would then be rewarded from them. So whether that's where they choose to buy their paper from, coming to Officeworks, or whether that's in the reputational benefits, which we know that trusted brands and a good reputation actually has a monetary value associated with it. Similarly, we looked at what it meant for our team. So we know that increasingly people want to work for employers that have a really great commitment to the environment and ESG credentials. And so we also saw that the role of the initiative would have tangible impacts. And what our team have told us is that we're probably, when we compare ourselves to the industry through our climate survey and employee surveys, we're one of the leaders in terms of having a genuine commitment to the environment, and also that our team can be involved. So we have planting days and we get them out to work with Greening Australia so that they're out of the shop floor or out of the office and really understanding the impacts. And it's really powerful. So I remember our CFO a couple of years ago went to one of our planting days, and it was out in Colac, and he used to go to the farm out there when he was a kid, and he saw firsthand the impact of climate. The dams were dry, the impacts to the land had changed in just his lifetime, and he came back and shared that with the team in a really emotional video that touched 10,000 team members. And so I think, again, when we consider that whole aspect of it, it's about how committed they are, how engaged they are, but also how we can educate them. And then the other aspects in terms of the farmers and the landholders, which I'm always so inspired by when I meet them, is just the actual practical economic outcomes of investing in land restoration. So farmers down in Colac, as the trees have grown, haven't needed to use pesticides on their land. So they're reducing their costs, they're getting better outcomes on the land. Other farmers are taking note and starting to engage with tree planting and Greening Australia as well. And similarly, from the role of more social aspects, in talking to one of our landholders in Tasmania, Julian, he spoke about through having Greening Australia partnership and tree planting, he understood that he actually had a role to play in reconciliation with his local Indigenous groups by inviting them back onto the land, and Greening Australia helped facilitate that, and they participated in some of the country burning. And again, he said that was just so emotional. And so I think when we think about that value, it is so far reaching about why we should. It just takes a different lens to how we may look at things traditionally.
Thank you, Ryan, very much. And I think that leads on very nicely to Damien. Damien is a leader of a major bank who's taking steps to take action on climate change. What do you see as the economic benefits of investing in the environment and the costs of inaction?
Great, thanks, Sue. I might just check, is my sound coming through okay? Yeah, perfect, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to actually just pick up initially from Elizabeth's comments and then Ryan's. And I totally agree. We need a healthy environment to support a healthy economy, and that's at a very high level. Clearly, when we're looking at things like climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, these are becoming mainstream conversations. They're in boardrooms around the country and globally. It is a governance issue for business in terms of thinking about the role that our businesses play in how we decarbonise the economy and how we transition to net zero, but also how we build trust. And I think, Ryan, you spoke to trusted brands, and responding to a couple of your key stakeholders beyond your shareholders in terms of both your customers and your employees is really important in terms of how you think about the role of business in terms of creating economic development, but also sustainable development, and being able to generate profit for purpose, or being able to grow your business so that you're both rewarding people, planet and prosperity. And I think that that's really important when you think about that ecosystem type thinking is that business and government have roles to play in how we build healthy natural environments. And we don't degrade. I mean, clearly the opposite is you continue to degrade the natural environment, then that'll create increasing risks around managing your business. Climate and biodiversity loss are two being called out today, but I think those economic risks start to become very tangible for businesses when you think about if you continue to degrade the natural environment, then it's going to make our job of creating opportunity for people and communities that much harder, and it's going to become exponentially more difficult. You think about natural disaster, the flow-on impacts that we've seen locally around, whole communities being devastated. But if you're in the business of insurance, then that becomes really challenging about how do you actually insure areas that are becoming increasing risks. How do you actually underwrite premiums for those areas? And as a banker, housing stock is often the security that underlines the loans that we lend to in those areas. So if houses can't be insured, then that changes the risk paradigm in terms of lending in those communities. So I think the whole interconnectedness of the natural environment and the business environment is becoming more and more critical. Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, Damien. It's really good to hear it's becoming part of the mainstream conversation and part of around the boardroom tables. And I think that leads on to our next question to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, how do we shift our perception of risk versus opportunity when considering climate action and the economy in Australia? And what benefits stand to be gained from doing so?
Yeah, look, I think, your question is exactly right. I think as a country, we have been very much focused on the risks to our economy associated with a decarbonising world. Australia is fundamentally an energy exporter, and our coal industry, our gas industry have been fundamental building blocks of our economy, and they're actually deeply embedded in our social fabric as well. So I think it's important to acknowledge that the transition isn't just hard from an economic perspective, it's also really hard and challenging from a social perspective as well. And this is where that concept of the just transition is so important. So as we talk about a decarbonising world, we really need to make sure that we're bringing everyone along for that journey. And that means for those communities that have been dependent on the fossil fuel industry, we need to think about how to provide them with the jobs and the socioeconomic opportunities for them to be prosperous as well into the future. We need to think about issues like reliability of our energy grid, absolutely, as we decarbonise our economy as well. However, I think so much of this debate needs to shift to focus on the enormous strengths that Australia has in a decarbonising world as well. We have extensive resources of the types of raw materials and minerals that can play a real role in a decarbonising future. The non-ferrous metals, the critical commodities, the rare earth elements that are needed to manufacture batteries and renewable energy infrastructure and enable technology and automation and so forth. We have a really important role we can play there. We have a talented and skilled workforce with deep technical expertise, and we can rebuild a manufacturing sector which can truly add value to these commodities that we do have available here in Australia. We have abundant renewable energy here. We've got wind energy, solar energy, and the capacity to export that as well to the world through commodities such as hydrogen, through direct connection to our neighbours in Southeast Asia as well. We have one of the most efficient and resilient agriculture sectors in the world, operating on one of the harshest continents on this planet, which has shown, for hundreds of years that it can operate with minimal government assistance, really. And I think finally, and probably relevantly to this conversation as well, we have some of the world's most biodiverse and valuable ecosystems here: the Great Barrier Reef, the Daintree rainforest, the Gondwana rainforest, the biodiverse ecosystems of Western Australia. So we have this amazing natural capital, which actually gives us a real advantage in markets for carbon and biodiversity. So I think I think what we need to do is start to see these opportunities and then work on those challenges to really shift our thinking. This new world order is something that Australia can fundamentally deliver great value in, and we need to find those solutions, develop a plan, set a vision and an ambition as a country, and then systematically work to achieve it. And I strongly believe that we have the skills, the resources to enable us to do that.
Encouraging to hear, thank you. Ryan, Officeworks was awarded the Large Business Transformation Award at the 33rd National Business Banksia Sustainability Awards last week, and congratulations for that. Ryan, can you tell us a bit about Officeworks' sustainability journey to date and the impact this has had on your customers and your bottom line?
Yes, well, thank you, Sue. It was great, really great recognition for our team and partners more broadly. So I suppose our journey, and I've been with Officeworks for 8 years now, so I've had that privileged position of seeing that evolution and transformation. But from 2013, it was really a well-intended tactical approach. So we collected ink and toner cartridges, we did a bit of fundraising, but it wasn't until 2015 when we set our first long-term sustainability strategy out to 2020. And that was really developed by listening to our stakeholders and set targets around things like our commitment to sustainable paper and how we reduce our emissions. So that was our first strategic approach. And then come 2020, it shifted into that integrated approach into sustainability, into core business strategy. And so we now look at it as how do we really embed it in all of our decision-making processes. And as part of that integration, it's actually within our culture. One of our key values as a team is we're good humans and we look after each other, ourselves and the planet. And that really talks to that transformation journey. And then ultimately the action and innovation that comes from having 10,000 team members that are so well engaged. So when we think about sustainability, we are really taking that lens of, well, what's the value to the business? And we always take quite a concerted effort to make sure we're leading with that. And we think about it in 4 aspects. So firstly, from a reputational benefit, and I spoke about that earlier, but if I look at the example of that, when we celebrated our 1 millionth tree planting, we did a TV campaign last year. It was our highest emotional connected ad and also the highest recall. So it does talk to that link of how just consumers are really valuing the actions from business. If I think about the revenue, so driving positive outcomes in the short term, we've got about 2,000 products, which are now our Greener Choices range, most sustainable products across various categories. They're growing at 3 times faster than the non-traditional products. And that was really about helping customers find them, but then also sourcing products to really start to grow that market. And then on the flip side, it's about how do you reduce the negative impact? So reducing costs. And we've got a lot of great examples here, from energy to waste. At one point last year, because we were recycling over 90%, our waste stream that used to be a pretty significant expense was actually an income stream. And similarly, how do you start to mitigate risk, as we heard earlier? And again, earlier this month, we announced a long-term deal to secure 100% renewable energy in Queensland. And so we are starting to mitigate those risks exposed to price volatility and energy security through the actions that we can take to decarbonise. So I think when you look at it that way, it is really, you can really drive that meaningful value creation. And that kind of leads on to, if I think about where we're at now. So we recently invested in the world's biggest garage sale, which is a social enterprise that repairs and repurposes damaged and faulty goods. We see the value in transitioning to a net zero circular economy, which is why making an investment like something like that is supporting the businesses that we need to create the jobs we need and address the issues that we know exist beyond just Officeworks. And if you think about all of the returns that go back into retail and all of those faulty goods, the vast majority go into landfill. And if back to the economic case of why we would action, well, what value are we actually putting on the resources? What value are we putting on sending them to landfill versus how do we keep those products in use in our economy for longer? And so, what I would say, we recognise our leadership and the advocacy we play. And I think that's a really important part of businesses that are in a position that have evolved their sustainability journey.
So you really started off as a feel-good, consumer-driven initiative, and really it's now becoming that bottom line as well for the company.
Yeah, it's definitely been about listening to all our stakeholders, engaging with the ENGOs and listening to investors. Customers are obviously a key stakeholder group, but the value cuts across all of our stakeholders.
Thank you. Damien, going on to you now. If we consider the risks ongoing nature loss poses to organisations and societies, how can a shift towards sustainability generate economic opportunities? Now, can you provide some examples of what you've seen through the bank and actually what the bank is doing itself?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sue. And yeah, our journey has been about 20 years now. So ours probably wasn't similar story to Ryan, but not so much about, feel good activity, but it was more around our ownership structure. So as a cooperative enterprise or a customer-owned bank, and we've had 72 mergers over 60 odd years of credit unions coming together and scaling up this business. And it was really about how do we create value for our customers who own the bank, and how do we then repurpose that in a contemporary way so that we're also attracting the next generation of consumers in. And the great thing about the history of our organisation and all of those mergers is that they're all trying to solve problems in society. The institutions were identified a gap where they were trying to meet human needs. And so we asked ourselves what was a contemporary issue that we could use the business of banking to help address. And it was the nascent 20 years ago, emergence of sustainable development and how we might build that into our business model. And of course, engaging with our customers during that journey. And the number one thing that they tell us is important to them is action on climate change. So how do we use the business of banking to address climate change? So looked at our internal operations, became carbon neutral back in 2011, invested in long-term renewable energy contracts, similar to Ryan's description, so back in 2019. And the interesting thing about entering into those contracts is they also enabled the development of new renewable energy infrastructure. So it was about introducing new energy into the grid as well. And so our contracts were to do with a new wind development. And that's been really important, I think, in terms of how we think about our own footprint and reduce the impact that we're having on the environment. But taking it to the next level was more about how do we assist our customers to transition to net zero and reduce their, carbon footprint as well. And so we provide pricing signals to help them shift towards electrification. So electric vehicles over combustion engines, or pricing benefits for those that are building high energy efficient, sustainably designed homes, so that we can help our customers transition towards renewable energy and removing fossil fuels from their, the operating of their homes and their everyday lives. So I think how we can drive that economic benefit for both our customers who own the bank, but also evidence that you can do good and drive a profitable business as well. And profit's important to everyone. We use our profits to reinvest in the business, to grow the business. And over the last 6 years and the last couple of years in particular, we've been growing 3 to 4 times system. So if the whole banking system's growing at this level, we've been growing at an exponential rate. And I think that that's because customers and consumers are looking for trusted brands, and being able to evidence and being open and transparent. Elizabeth, you spoke about the challenges around measurement. That's one of those areas where when you're measuring your scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, scope 3, is difficult in terms of getting consistent measurements, globally, that we all approach the challenge in the same way. But I think doing that's really important, because not just measuring, but also setting targets. And where if you don't achieve those targets, that you're open and transparent about, why you've missed those particular targets. And we've set some targets for net zero by 2035, which I might talk to a little bit later. But, one thing that we recognise is we don't have all the answers, but we're on the journey, and we'll work with our key stakeholders, our customers and our staff, to help solve some of these really intractable and challenging problems.
So, Damien, you said you offered incentives for customers for electric vehicles and houses that are more sustainable. Is that in the form of lower interest rates or?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, I think those pricing signals are really important because people often assume that if you're buying goods that have got a sustainability focus, or goods or services, that you have to pay a premium for them, and that's not always the case.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, good to hear. Elizabeth, we're talking now about the Descriptor review on the economics of biodiversity, which came out last year, I think it was, and it describes nature as our most precious asset and explains that our economies are embedded within nature, not external to it, which is a thought that a lot of people always don't work through, especially in corporate Australia. Can you explain what this means and outline your thoughts on Australia's transition to a robust nature-based economy?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's I have to say that reading the Descriptor review was actually one of those, a really transformative moment in my thinking. And for anyone who works in this area, who's really interested in understanding more about what we need to do to transform our economic system, I would strongly recommend reading it. It's a long read, but it's well and truly worth it for kind of changing your thinking. And I think I've talked earlier about how we are so dependent on ecosystem services for our economy. They directly support the way that our businesses run. So I really have, I think I would argue that we've put forward that hypothesis. We really are deeply connected to nature. We're surrounded by nature. We're dependent on nature. The way that we conduct our business, our personal lives, involves interaction with nature all of the time. And I think a fundamental next step associated with the Descriptor review is, if we are so dependent on nature, then we need to have the right economic system to help us to value that, so that we understand the support that we're receiving from our natural world, and that we're making sure that we're protecting that for the longer term. And Descriptor's puts forward a strong case to say we actually need to change our economic system, that the measure that we have at the moment of GDP is fundamentally not taking into account the negative impact that our business activities are having on nature through the way that we go about our business. And so Descriptor's argument is we need to be developing a system for valuing nature is the fundamental first step. We need to actually understand what nature is worth so that we can start to value that. We need to make sure that we are investing in our natural assets in a way that they can continue to provide value for the long term. We have an issue at the moment whereby we're using far more of our natural assets than they can actually replenish themselves, and we need to address this and change the way that our world runs, to encourage and incentivise through measures such as Damien's just been describing, our people to undertake lives in a way that is less impactful on our natural environment as well. However, he actually goes a step beyond just natural capital and argues we need to be taking into account a broad range of other factors that influence our productivity as well. So he talks about intellectual capital and human capital as well as being fundamentally important to how we value our world. And I think this is starting to hark back to some other frameworks that we often use in sustainability reporting around value creation, and understand those value creation models as well, and what they look like. But fundamentally, I think we have to change the way that we work as an economy. We have to have different types of balance sheets. We need to be taking into account a very long-term view. We need to be thinking about our children, about future generations and their dependency on nature. And this concept of intergenerational equity is fundamentally important as well. So I think the argument here is, we are entwined within nature, but we're not adequately accounting for how that process works. And we need to change our economic system to adequately take that into account.
So like Bhutan measures happiness, we should all be measuring economic development based on that nature outcomes as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think arguably happiness should be part of it. It's not just about having jobs, it's about having jobs that are meaningful, that are contributing value. And I think a big shake-up is well and truly due.
Thank you. Ryan, what advice? Sorry. Go on, Damien.
Oh, sorry, it's Damien here. Just a quick one for Elizabeth while we're there. what are your thoughts around the International Accounting Standards starting to think about measurement of net zero targets and carbon footprints in terms of the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, and integrated reporting, starting to become more mainstream, which I think when you're talking about moving beyond GDP as a measure of growth, that, it's interesting to see those developments occurring now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely fundamental that that companies start to measure their greenhouse gas emissions, and the development of these global standards is really important in enabling us to systematically evaluate the performance of companies. So when we have global agreement on frameworks for measuring performance from an environmental and a social perspective, it means that we'll actually be able to make decisions about who we invest in, the types of activities that receive our finance, and so forth. I'm interested to see these new standards develop over the coming years. I have some questions around issues such as double materiality. So this concept of investor-driven materiality versus doing the right thing as a company. But I think that will come out in the wash, and so a really important step.
Obviously, companies are really talking about this, front and central now. And so Ryan, you're sitting at the forefront of it all. What advice would you give to other corporates in the early stages of their business transformation, or who are hesitant to commence a transformation to a sustainable business model because they think it's going to impact their bottom line?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, those that are hesitant, it actually goes to the heart of the sustainability of their business. So I don't think they really have a choice. And so really, if you are on the transformation or looking at it, where do I start? Anchor it with what are my stakeholders saying, so that you can really identify those strategic issues to your business, because that's when you link it back and generate the most value, rather than casting your net wide. I then think it's just really critical to get your leadership team aligned on those priorities, endorsed and advocating for the action. And then it's about how do you empower your team and embed that culture. And I think, you really can't estimate the payback if you take time to, depending on your team structure, but take time to bring them on that journey, explain the why. I mean, we all understand things better when we know why we're doing it, why we're on that journey. And again, in a really practical sense, taking our team to tree planting days or getting them to sort through their bins so they understand how to recycle is a really key part of that journey, and embedding that culture and bringing them along. Then I think it's about learning from your peers. I mean, obviously there's lots of businesses out there that are doing so many great things, and this is, it's not a competitive space. Like, I think we should really welcome a healthy dose of competition, because it always makes us a bit better, but we also have a lot to share and learn from each other. And so those ones that are starting have got a bit of catch up to do, and we know we need to move quicker to get to a net zero circular economy. The other one I would then say is just measure and communicate from day one. Obviously, everything's underpinned by data, and lead with that value creation first. I mean, I don't give those practical examples of Officeworks to kind of shout about what we're doing. It's more to say we've got to be really comfortable and understand what is the value we're driving from this, because it's on businesses, it's on the private sector at the moment to really make that change. And then finally, just sustainability teams. So for subject matter experts, the skills needed from those teams are really different to what they were, 2, 3, 5 years ago. We're talking about change agents. We're talking about understanding behavioural change and behavioural science to mobilise people, influencing. So really take the time to develop those softer skills that are actually going to be crucial to bring your organisation along.
Is it very important to, in an organisational structural sense, that ESG sits in the main part of the organisation, not off to the side as it often has in the past?
Yeah, I think, again, what we've seen structurally, there's obviously different ways you could position energy and carbon in property, for example, or you might have ethical sourcing in merchandise. We've probably for the last 4 years have had a dedicated team, and it's now a team of about 10 people. And I think what is really powerful is that you've got a values aligned team. We're quite purpose driven. Our purpose is to empower others to embrace positive change. And so with that comes a responsibility to impart knowledge, continuing to build our own knowledge, but really embedding practices across the business. And so that's been successful for us at least.
And which is directly aligned to the CEO and the board as well?
Yes, yeah.
Terrific. Leading on again to you, Damien, on that one. Bank Australia has announced its climate action strategy with an ambitious target of net zero emissions by 2035. What are you learning from customers about the value they place on climate action, and how are you doing this?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Listening to customer voices has been really important to us because, I'm sorry if there's background noise, I've got a noisy motorbike out on the street in front of me. But it's actually been interesting, that dialogue, because they've certainly encouraged us to think beyond just a 2050 target. So the message quite clearly from our customers has been 2050 is too late. It's just too late. The next decade is really critical in terms of how we address biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. So setting ambitious targets and going on that journey with our customers. So it's not just about us, but it's how we help our customers through that just transition, and also the communities where we operate. We've got about a third of our workforce down in Latrobe Valley, and one of those credit unions that we merged with over the years was the old State Electricity Corporation or Staff Employee Credit Union, which was later called Enterprise Credit Union. So we've got actually a bit of a heritage position down in the Latrobe Valley. And one of the things I always talk to my people about is that, you know, the economy down there is in transition. The coal-fired power stations are closing down, and it's inevitable that those that are remaining will also close down over the next decade or so. So we've got a role to play in that community in terms of helping them through that transition, and creating diverse or alternate employment in that community to help them with that transition is really important to us as an employer. So whilst we don't invest in fossil fuels, I think it's really important that we create opportunity when you see, you know, a community like that that's going to face into some challenges over the next decade. And I think, you know, our customers want us to be part of the solution for them. And I think that's really important because, like I said before, we don't have all the answers, and we've set ourselves some ambitious targets for 2035. And there'll be learnings through that process around how to measure and report, and how to respond to emerging issues as they come through. Double counting, Elizabeth. So I think it's something where I think if we don't get it right, we'll be open and transparent and certainly clear with our people around that. But I think being ambitious also helps to drive positive outcomes, and hopefully, you know, we get to a better place by 2035 than where we are today.
Well, I mean, given the gravity of the messages coming out of the IPCC report this week, which basically said it was now or never, and we had to have a dash to a low carbon economy, or that was climate crisis, you know, disaster time. What actually gives you hope in the face of climate change and biodiversity loss? And we've got election obviously coming up, with not much talk about climate change. How do you see it's changing? Is it business leading the way, or the community leading the way, rather than, you know, the politicians? Yeah, Elizabeth first. Sorry, Damien. Yep, go on.
Oh yeah, sorry. Look, I think we've all got a role to play. So, you know, in our personal and our private lives and the choices that we make, but as leaders in business, you know, how we actually engage our organisation and make sure sustainable development is core to your strategic, you know, intent and your strategic plan, and it's not a CSR program that's off to the side. You know, it's really key about who you are, and it goes to your DNA and your culture, and so I think that if people and communities and business are part of driving that change, then, you know, there's a role that government will play as well.
Elizabeth, your hopeful?
I definitely am hopeful. I think, I've been working in the climate change area for 16 years now, and it's fair to say it has been quite a roller coaster ride over that period of time, with some, you know, very significant highs and some fairly significant lows over that period. But I have never felt as I have at the moment the level of energy and focus from across our economy. And it's not just communities. I think business is keen for change, government is keen for change, And there's a real energy and enthusiasm to really create a positive outcome. I'm also really excited about the connection of nature and climate change that we have seen come into our discussions over the past couple of years as well. I think we've known intellectually that they're connected for a long time, but I think nature is something that's tangible, that's critically important to almost everyone in society. And when we see that relationship between nature and climate change, it actually gives people something to really connect with, and I think is really helping us to drive that positive focus for the future.
Briefly, Ryan, you too, you're hopeful?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got to have hope, right? We know we can solve this issue, and I think the thing that is really positive is just the shift from the mainstream Australians, and we see it in our research in 2 years. The understanding around sustainability, the thinking now around actually people starting to get circular economy and the benefits, and obviously wanting climate action. We're seeing the impacts, and I think to Damien's point, just the role that we can all play, like every dollar we spend, it really does matter, and how we engage internally in our place of work. Every person has the opportunity to drive change. We've got so many great examples that have started from someone, and when you think about that collectively, that power, that is pretty powerful.
Yeah. Terrific. Well, thank you all so much, Elizabeth, Damien, and Ryan. We've got time for our general conversation today. We'll wrap up the discussion here, but we will now move on to questions from our guests, because we've had a lot coming in. We've had quite a few coming in on the chat room, so I'll start by asking some of these, but for all our attendees, if you have any further questions, post them now and we'll get through as many as we can. Please remember to select the everyone option when posting so we can all see your messages. Now, my first question comes from Warren to all the panel. It's great each of us can do our bit, and that business is also lining up to help. But we really need to switch the story and laws and incentives at a federal government level. Aside from our vote, how do we actually do this, in your view? Elizabeth, first.
I'm sorry, I missed some of that, Sue. I think your microphone faded out a bit.
Apologies. Basic question was, everyone's expressed businesses do how do we switch the story at a federal government level, aside from our vote? How do we do this?
So I think you might be holding a document over your laptop, so it actually is interfering with the microphone.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, the question is basically, how do we get the government to switch their story at the federal government level, apart from the way we vote?
So I think the question was, how do we get action from federal government except through how we vote? I mean, I think voting is probably one of the key things we can do. I think having a voice. I think all of us having a view on on what's important to us is really important, and probably sharing our thoughts and with other people is important as well. But I think fundamentally voting for what you believe in, thinking about the long term in terms of those decisions that we're going to be making in a month or so's time, is really key from my perspective.
Damien?
I'm sorry, I actually really didn't hear the question. I do think, though, if the community is sending strong messages to any political party that addressing the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis is important to them, then politicians will listen. Inevitably, they will. Ryan,
your thoughts?
Yeah, so to build on that, I suppose, what we do know is there's a lot of industry groups, if I think about the Business Council of Australia, that have released their position on climate action that ties in with the economic developments. I mean, there is a lot of advocacy happening in different pockets. And so I think, it is on all of us within the private sector. How do we feed up through the right channels directly or through our industry representatives? And then coupled with absolutely what we can do as individuals, and how do we mobilise our own communities?
Thank you. And a question from Leah for Damien. Can you hear all right? At a sector level, how can financial institutions play an even larger role than they currently are in delivering and planning a decarbonised world?
Yeah, so the finance sector is actually really critical to how we shift the economy towards net zero or towards sustainable development, because I think the finance system is almost like the lifeblood in many ways around And I'm actually quite pleased because I've been in a number of forums where the prudential regulator and the leaders of large financial institutions have actually spoken about the importance of action on climate change and ESG. So I think there's a real desire to, mobilise industry to address some really critical issues. Now, targets will be set out to 2050, and all of us have a role to play in terms of how we respond to and deal with those challenges. But I do think that the finance industry, whether you think superannuation, insurance, banking, that they are all deeply thinking about the risks and opportunities in this space.
And that's because things are becoming uninsurable. We're seeing houses washed away on the coast, those sorts of things.
That's part of it, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. A question from Michelle for everybody. Natural values are priceless regardless of economic values. Protection and restoration of the biosphere is paramount. Would you like to comment on that thought?
Yeah, I can.
Ryan? Yep.
I can jump in first. I mean, absolutely. I mean, how wonderful is nature, and where would we be without it? I think the challenge is, how do you translate that into a business sense? And so we do need to find a way where we can value it to some degree so that we can make sure we're investing and prioritising. Probably my take.
Elizabeth, does that have to be through a sort of index or a GDP type index, or what are your thoughts?
Look, I think one of the challenges is when we talk about kind of large scale wilderness protection and so forth, it's very hard to put an economic value on that. I think we're going to have social values, cultural values, well-being, health and well-being values associated with with these, with wild places, with natural ecosystems. And my view is we can't boil everything down to a dollar figure. We're going to actually have to start having, having different sets of accounts. We're going to have environmental accounts, social accounts, financial and economic accounts, so that we can actually value these assets and make the right decisions with regards to protecting and investing in them.
I know we've all had this conversation amongst ourselves and in the community, but as a question comes from Lucy to everybody, is how does this conversation we're having, which sometimes has a feel-good aspect to it, actually become reality and action? Damien?
Yeah, interesting. I remember sitting in forums, 20 years ago, and sustainability was being discussed and ESG issues, and I always felt slightly disappointed because it was always the same people talking to each other about the same issues, and it was very niche. Whereas today I'm seeing these conversations happen with, right across the boards, right across, with directors at that governance level across industry in the country, and that's a step change for me. Like this has now become mainstream, and I think that as we're seeing businesses respond to the risks and opportunities in this space, that this will continue to evolve and develop. So for me, it's really more about stepping out of the sideline and becoming part of the mainstream, and to be the part of the solution.
Ryan?
Yeah, I think from our side, one of the challenges has always been actually how do we communicate what we're doing. That's probably our biggest opportunity. We tend to just get on and do it, and so it may feel like, and in some pockets, absolutely, there's not enough action. But I think there is stuff happening. It's how do we make sure we're communicating effectively to really bring people along and mobilise even greater. And that's something we're working on ourselves.
Elizabeth? Look,
I would probably echo the comments of Ryan and Damien. I think talking about what we're doing is really important. There absolutely is a recognition across our economy that we need to be addressing climate change and addressing depletion of our natural assets. We're seeing some really exciting work being done. I'm working with some of the, the traditionally the really dirty industries who are doing amazing things, transforming their, their former mine sites, for example, into biodiverse forests and so forth. There is exciting stuff happening. I think we really just have to start talking about it and the value that it's bringing. So I think understanding there's this exciting stuff happening, it's bringing value, it's making people excited, and we just have to get out there and talk about it more.
And at a corporate level, do you think it's got past the stage of our customers want us to do this, or we have to do this, or we'll lose out to our competitors, to a point where if we don't do it, we're going to have a world we can't live in? Where are the corporate sectors sitting on that front?
Oh, I think it's part of your competitive advantage. So, Ryan spoke a little bit to that earlier, but clearly, there's opportunity, there's economic and prosperity opportunities, and the way that create jobs and provide people with meaningful employment. And, I think that's really positive. So I think it's really about that. That's probably a stronger driver for me than saying, oh, it's doom and gloom and the world's coming to an end, so we need to act because of the negative attributes. I think it's more about the positive and the opportunity that's in front of us to drive that, competitive advantage.
Elizabeth, what do you hear on that one?
Oh, I would completely agree. I think it's, people are very excited by the opportunity. I think when you create this vision of a world where we have clean air, we have natural ecosystems, where, we're using active travel to move around our communities, it's very hard not to engage with that. I think it's a really positive story to tell. And so I think we need to be talking about it more.
A question from Naomi just came into all the panel. Who and what are the forces that are opposing a move away from using GDP as our key measurement to using other indices? Is it governments? Is it the oil and gas and energy sector, or who are the problems that don't want to talk about moving the way we discuss our economy? Elizabeth?
I actually don't know that there's necessarily any barriers. I think we probably are still at the theoretical stage. I would argue that a lot of these discussions are still very academic. And certainly actually government is doing exciting work, for example, in the blue carbon space around trying the UN environmental economic accounts for blue carbon ecosystems. So I think we're seeing this work happening, but it's still all very exploratory and early stage. And I think the real challenge is, how do you actually accelerate that? How do we move it from the academic and the conceptual to something that we actually apply? And I think it just needs more people. It needs more people who are passionate about this to really get in and help us make that transition.
Any thoughts, Damien? Yeah,
I was reflecting on the fact that, accounting measures have taken hundreds and hundreds of years to develop. And I agree with Elizabeth. I think a lot of the other measures are still very theoretical, and how do we manage or measure and report against, social and governance issues. So I think that there's certainly academic interest in this space, and that's been growing. It's more about just how do we actually bring that to life in very practical terms, but also ensure that, we're setting global measures so that we can actually try and get some consistency across the various jurisdictions where, business operates.
Thank you. That's all we've got time for, unfortunately, today in this webinar. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Ryan and Damien, for joining us and for sharing your insights. And thanks to all the attendees for enjoying our event today. And I'm sorry if we didn't get around to your question. As part of its 40th anniversary celebrations, Greening Australia is working to raise the awareness of the value of nature and the cost of inaction on climate change and biodiversity loss. Obviously, all these conversations we've had today. There's obviously been the release of the white paper mentioned earlier by Greening Australia, and we'd encourage you all to have a read of that article, the green paper, the white paper. Greening Australia and Bank Australia have also created a tangible symbol of this value, the money tree, a sculpture that's currently on display outside the State Library of Victoria in Melbourne, CBD. This artwork will be on display until Monday. So for those in Melbourne, make sure you head down to the city to see it. If you'd like to provide any feedback on this event, please contact a member of the Greening Australia team. And obviously there'll also be some links to some of the documents that were discussed today. The communications team can be released on communications greeningaustralia.org.au. Thank you all so very much, and we look forward to having kind of further these chats later on, and obviously we hope this conversation keeps on circulating around the environment and around the business world. Thank you and goodbye.